Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and Mount Auburn Hospital, I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's Thursday morning talk with Thomas Abt, joined in conversation by Commissioner Branville Bard. In just a moment, I'll turn you over to Myra von Turkovich, who will be introducing our program this morning. But first, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. The talk will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the conversation today, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit your question. We'll get through as many as time allows. And in just a moment, I'll post the link in the chat to purchase Bleeding Out from Harvard Bookstore. Now more than ever, your purchases support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for tuning in. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now, I'm so pleased to turn things over to Myra von Turkovich. Myra, the digital podium is yours.
Thank you, Serena. And a great intro. You actually took many words out of my mouth. Welcome to the second Thursday morning talks for 2021. It's Thursday, January 14th. I'm happy to introduce our two guests. Thomas Abt teaches, studies, and writes about the use of evidence-informed approaches to address urban gun violence and other public safety problems. He is the author of Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. It was published by Basic Books in June of 2019. Abt is a senior fellow with the Council on Criminal Justice in Washington, D.C., where he directs the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice. Prior to the council, he served as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy and law schools. Before that, he held leadership positions in the New York Governor's Office and the U.S. Department of Justice. Abt's work has been featured in major media outlets, including The Atlantic, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and National Public Radio. His TED Talk is available and has been seen by over 165,000 viewers. Thomas was born, raised, and currently lives here in Cambridge. Our other guest is Dr. Branville Bard Jr. He has a 28-year life in law enforcement and currently serves as the police commissioner for the city of Cambridge. Bard previously served as the chief of police and director of public safety of the Philadelphia Housing Authority Police Department. Bard started his law enforcement career as a member of the Philadelphia Police Department, where he retired at the rank of inspector after 22 years of service. Bard earned a doctorate in public administration from Valdosta State University and holds 2 master's degrees and a BA in criminal justice. He is the author of Racial Profiling Towards Simplicity and Eradication, 2014. He is a pre-academic who is heavily influenced by the procedural and social justice movements. Dr. Bard is married and has 3 children. Welcome, gentlemen. Enjoy. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'll start off the conversation. Thomas, thanks for inviting me here to have this conversation with you. And you write this fantastic book, Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace on the Streets. I have it here, and I don't want to embarrass you, but I don't give out compliments and lightly. And when I say fantastic, I do really mean it's a fantastic book. I don't know if the audience can see it, but you can tell by how I mark up a book, how good the book is, and you can't find a page in this book that I haven't, marked up. And It's fantastic. So Thomas, I want to start off by asking you to explain to us what you mean by the term urban violence, and then explain also why we should focus on it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Bard, for doing this. It's a real pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be on Thursday morning talks and with the Harvard Bookstore. Serena, since we got started a little bit early, what I might recommend is some people may have missed the bios, so you might just want to dump those in the chat so that people can take a look as we get going. But to answer your question, what is urban violence? Urban violence is the lethal or potentially lethal violence that happens on the streets of our cities. And it goes by many different names, each of which captures a different aspect of the problem. It's also known as street violence, youth violence, gang violence, gun violence, and community violence. And this is the violence that happens typically among the most disadvantaged and disenfranchised in our society, mostly between young men without a lot of options or much hope. And in terms of why we should care about this type of violence, it's enormously costly. The total social cost of a single homicide is more than $10 million, both in terms of law enforcement costs, medical costs, corrections costs, lost labor, all of these different things. But it's obviously enormously devastating to the individuals themselves, their families, and community members. It's very important to understand that urban violence causes more deaths here in the United States than any other form of violence. Since 9/11, it's true that hundreds have died from things like mass shootings and domestic terrorism, but well over 100,000 have died due to the routine, everyday shootings and killings associated with urban violence. And unfortunately, I have some bad news for our viewers today. 2020, based on the data that we're seeing right now, looks to be the largest single year increase in homicide that's ever been recorded in the United States. According to the data that we have now, there's about a 33% increase in homicides among the nation's largest cities. Across the river in Boston, there's a more than 50% increase in homicides and in shootings. And since the single greatest homicide increase was about 12.7% back in the 80s, we expect that the single year increase will be much higher than that and will make unfortunate history. So this is an extremely important issue. And the homicides this year were driven by precisely this type of violence, urban violence.
So that drives the total societal cost up into the hundreds of billions of dollars based on the numbers you just put out there, right?
Absolutely.
Wow, that's astronomical. So one of the themes of the book is triage, or the need to triage our situation. Can you help us understand how triage is the most practical need when dealing with urban violence?
Sure. I struggled in the book to sort of how could I best communicate the urgency of the issue of violence and to explain how violence impacts everything else that matters in urban life and living. And I really decided to sort of use this metaphor of the emergency room. And basically arguing that, when a young man comes in with a gunshot wound, we don't offer him counseling. We don't, ask him about his housing situation. We also don't lock him up. The first thing we do is we treat the gunshot wound and we save the young man's life, because unless we save the young man's life, nothing else will matter. And so that metaphor is as true in the emergency room as it is in communities, as it is for the country at large. And so my argument is that if you want to address homicide, you have to address it directly, and you have to address it first, not because it's the most important thing about urban life, but it makes everything else about urban life, and particularly in poor communities of color, much harder. So if you care about the education of poor people living in cities, if you care about their health, if you care about their economic prospects, if you care about racial disparities all throughout society, my argument is that urban violence is making each of those issues much, much harder. And so just as a matter of sequence, not as a matter of importance, we have to treat it first.
So thanks for that. So, all right, so sticking with the major themes of bleeding out, you address all aspects of patient care, so to speak. We talked about triage just now, but you also discuss diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis as you progress through the text. So I like to spend a little bit of time discussing each of these critical aspects. So part one of the book is diagnosis. Three major themes, or as you call them, fundamental principles emerge. That's the stickiness of crime, the balancing of punishment and prevention, and the need to build legitimacy. If you could start with the stickiness of crime and just walk us through how each of these fundamental principles impact the diagnosis.
Right. So using this public health metaphor, if you're going to be able to treat an injury or an illness, you have to understand it. And so you have to be able to diagnose it. And, before writing the book, I completed a diagnosis of my own. Myself, while I was at the Harvard Kennedy School, I'm now with the Council on Criminal Justice in Washington, D.C. But at the time I was a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, I was working with my colleague, Professor Chris Winship. And together we performed something that called a systematic meta review, where we got our hands empirically around all of the evidence, and I do mean all of the evidence, the rigorous evidence around urban violence reduction. And so we synthesized the results of over 1,400 individual impact evaluations. And what we found were these common themes that kept coming up about the most successful anti-violence approaches. And those were these themes that you just mentioned: focus, balance, and fairness. What focus means is that what we found again and again is that urban violence is sticky, meaning that it concentrates among a surprisingly small number of people and places. Let's again look at Boston. Boston has the Boston Regional Intelligence Center that crunches the numbers and identifies the highest risk individuals in the city. The BRIC has identified, as it's known, about a list that varies between 250 and 350 high impact individuals. And these are the individuals that drive the violence in Boston. Not thousands of people, not large percentages, not groups of people of color. These small numbers of individuals are driving the individual. Similarly, in Boston, research by Anthony Braga has demonstrated that about 70% of shootings in Boston over the past 3 decades or so occurred on just 5% of city blocks. So people always want to explain violence in terms of broad systematic factors, but it's actually quite concentrated. So we have to be, if the problem is sticky, then we have to have sticky solutions. That's the first one. Balance, again, as we've learned in Boston and elsewhere, you can't simply arrest your way out of urban violence, but you also can't just program your way out of urban violence. The evidence shows that you need both carrots and sticks. And in fact, there is no city that has sustainably reduced urban violence, either by just enforcing the law or by just using prevention programs, supports, and assistance. You have to have both. And then finally, one of the things that we see now more than ever in the wake of Minneapolis, in the wake of Ferguson, in the wake of Baltimore, and all of these other incidents, is that legitimacy matters. And that it matters not just to the overall society, but it matters in the actual practice of violence reduction. And if police and prosecutors and other members of law enforcement aren't seen as legitimate, and they aren't working hand in hand with impacted community members, they won't be successful over the long term. So improving police and law enforcement legitimacy is important for a ton of reasons, but it's also important in terms of keeping people safe.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you spent time and how you broke down how the punishment and prevention, it wasn't either or, but it was a both and that, prevention only wasn't going to be successful, and punishment only, the community wasn't going to let you get away with that and maintain your legitimacy. So not either or, but both and. And I really appreciated that as a practitioner, and understanding how true that is. So moving on. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think it's important just for the audience to know that you're currently chief or commissioner of the Cambridge Police Department. But as was said in your bio, Commissioner Bard worked for many years in Philadelphia, a very high crime, high violence city. And so he's had a lot of experience with this directly as well. So I just wanted our audience to know who they were talking with here.
I appreciate that. And in your book, when you talk about getting your hands on all the evidence and how these processes are evidence informed, you address studies done in Philadelphia. One of the studies of foot patrols, I was heavily involved in as the commander of one of the most troubled areas of Philadelphia. And, you see that the same thing you talked about Boston in your explanation, but you saw the same problems in Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore. So these, problems and the answers are generalizable over, across violence across this entire country. We talked about the treatments just now. So we triage treatments, the prognosis, the third part of the book. It tells us, well, actually that's the end of the book. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Part 2, we talk about treatments and programs that are evidence informed. You give us a great selection of people-based strategies, place-based strategies, because you talked about the stickiness and how things focus on a few hundred people and 5% of all of the thousands of blocks. So you give us people-based strategies, place-based strategies, and then you talk about strategies that mitigate behaviors that facilitate urban violence. Those behaviors: gun carrying, gang banging, violent drug dealing. So let's talk about those people-based strategies, place-based strategies, and then strategies to mitigate the behaviors.
Absolutely. So, we've gone through triage. We've explained why urban violence is important. We've now diagnosed urban violence and found that it's highly concentrated, responsible to both punishments and prevention, and that legitimacy is critical. And so now the question, as you said, is how do we actually treat the problem, treat this illness or injury? And so, the book is really intended to break things down in order to create practical ways that people can actually address this issue. So, and really my intent in writing the book for a mass audience and not writing it just for law enforcement or just for academics was that I wanted to create some type of movement to support these strategies. Because what we see all over the country is we see lots and lots of examples of temporary successes. So when people say, oh, we don't know how to reduce violence, we actually very much do know how to reduce
Yes, we do.
And we are constantly reducing violence, but we are never sustaining our work. And so that is a really critical point. And so what are these strategies that work? And so I break it down into strategies that are focused on these highest risk people, strategies that are focused on these highest risk places, and then strategies focused on these key behaviors. So what are some of the things that work? So in terms of a people-based strategy, one of the best strategies that we know of got its birth again in Boston, called the Boston Gun Project, or Boston Ceasefire. And it was pioneered by David Kennedy, Anthony Braga, the Boston Police Department, and along with significant community support from African-American clergy in Mattapan, Roxbury, Dorchester, and elsewhere. The 10-Point Coalition, which some of you may have heard of, was instrumental in this time as well. And so what this strategy essentially said is we have to identify the highest risk people, and then we have to engage them. We have to engage them collectively, not just as police, not just as clergy, not just as service providers. We have to come together and we have to engage them. And we have to send a very simple message, which is, we are here to help you. If you won't stop shooting, we are here to stop you. And so it was a message of both empathy and accountability. And then it was about making these promises and following through, offering both real supports and services, saying, look, we can help you. We can help you get a job. We can help you with housing. We can help you get a new driver's license. We can help you do all of these different things if you're willing to try to change your life. But if you're not willing to try to change your life, if you're going to persist in the most dangerous and most damaging behavior that is really strangling your own community, then we are going to remove you from the community, at least temporarily. And in Boston, that strategy, along with other efforts, led to the Boston Miracle, a 63% reduction in homicide. Now, the interesting thing about Boston is that while Boston was home to one of the most successful anti-violence strategies of all time, Boston ultimately lost focus, and people left and transitions left, and the urgency with which that problem was being addressed was lost. And then violence ticked up, and then more strategies were brought in. So Boston is not only an example of a success story, it's also an example of the challenges of building on that success and keeping it, making it continuous. So that's a good people-based strategy, how you engage the highest risk people, not just with threats, but also with promises of assistance. And then in terms of places, we have to remember that we're not talking about whole communities. We're talking about a certain housing project, a certain liquor store, a certain street corner, micro locations, not macro locations, not communities. And what do we do in those locations? Well, we know that giving more policing attention to those locations, having more police there can be effective, something known as hotspots policing. But it has to be done the right way. It can't be done in that sort of New York City style, aggressive order maintenance, zero tolerance, stop and frisk way. It has to be done in a way that's perceived as legitimate by the community, that's fair and respectful. And we also know that you can't just police these locations. You have to invest in them. And how do we do that? And in fact, Philadelphia is a good example of how to do that. Philadelphia has a very robust, what's known as cleaning and greening program, where they go to these high-risk areas and they look for vacant buildings and abandoned lots and yards. And what we've learned is that these vacant buildings and abandoned lots are often sort of the sites of crimes. They're often where guns or drugs are hid. And so simply taking down those buildings or boarding them up and making them look nicer, beautifying these yards and removing trash and debris and all of these things. These things are a cost-effective way to start creating, start physically changing those hotspots. Now they don't have radical results. And I think that this is something that's important to understand. There's no one strategy that works to reduce violence. You need a portfolio of strategy, a people-based strategy, a place-based strategy, a behavior-based strategy, and they need to work together. And this is why no city to date has really been successful at sustainably, or very few cities have sustainably reduced violence. Because the fact of the matter is that they haven't been able to keep that coordination going. And that's really the challenge. And then the last type of strategy is the behavior-based strategy. People talk about guns when they talk about urban violence, they talk about gangs, and they talk about drugs. But my argument is that that is way too broad a way to approach this issue. It's not about guns per se. It's about illegal gun carrying by these highest risk individuals. And it's not about gangs as a whole. It's about particular gangs and particular gang members engaging in violent conflicts in and around these hot places. And it's also not about drugs generally. I mean, one of the things we've seen with the opioid epidemic is, as deadly as it has been, it is not the cause of a large amount of urban violence. And so what we need to do is we need to have our broader treatment strategies, public health strategies for the drug problem, and focus our attention on urban violence only on the small number of drug dealers who are engaging in violence. And so that's the thing, is we need to target these things around a behavior that we can then attach to these high-risk people and high-risk places. And it's very counterintuitive, but the evidence is clear that if you want to reduce violence, the way to do it is to get small, not to get big. And let me just say this. I am a committed progressive, and I believe in working very hard to combat racism, to combat poverty, to combat all forms of inequality. But I have to acknowledge that that does not appear to be, according to the evidence, the best way to reduce violence. Everything we're learning about reducing violence says go after violence directly. So that's a bit about how to treat the problem.
And once again, it follows the pragmatism that you lay out in the book, the understanding that you focus on a community, but you don't focus on the entire community. You focus on the problem individuals and the problem locations in that community. One thing that
just one thing, I think that's really important for people to understand, because remember that we can often stigmatize poor people, particularly poor people of color, with this broad brush of violence. And we have to understand that's not what the facts say. The facts don't say that everybody in Mattapan or Dorchester or Roxbury is a potentially violent person. And it's deeply problematic, even racist, to think that.
Yes.
What it does say is that there is a very small number of individuals who are staining the broader community. And if we can focus on those individuals, not just for enforcement, but also for empathy, we can have an outsized impact. Sorry, Commissioner.
No, that's great. And one of the last points you make in that section is that you kind of follow the sequential intercept model, where you talk about the different types of individuals who engage in the violent behavior. You break down what to do and how to handle and how to prevent the would-be shooters from becoming shooters. You talk about the someday shooters, and then you talk about the bona fide shooters. You want to elaborate on that just a little bit?
Sure. So I think it's important to understand that someone doesn't become a quote unquote shooter overnight. And there are lots of opportunities to intervene with individuals before they become, quote, a bona fide shooter. And by bona fide, I mean someone who is unrepentant and persistently is involved in violence, is responsible for multiple shootings, often multiple homicides. And at that point, I think we all have to acknowledge that the right thing to do is to immediately get that person off the street, and as soon as possible. However, we really need to think about how that person got that way and the opportunities to intervene before that becomes possible. And one of the things that I'm suggesting is that many people will voluntarily change their lives, even if they've been engaged in violence in the past, if you give them the right combination of supports and they believe what you're doing is legitimate. And I'm also saying that we see warning signs for potential violence very early in life. And we can intervene with families, with troubled kids at schools and all of these things, and offer supports and services and cognitive behavioral treatment and therapy and all of these other things, so we don't have to ultimately resort to a law enforcement approach. And so this is a very important idea. And this is something I think that is really important for people to understand. Many progressives sort of believe that if you don't work with a child, and a child who's exhibiting different difficult behaviors or at-risk behaviors early, and they get into adolescence or adulthood, that they're essentially lost and that nothing can help them, and that all we can do is work on the next generation. That is not what the science says. The science says that we can intervene, provide evidence-based supports like cognitive behavioral therapy and other things, and we can help people at all stages work their way out of dangerous lifestyles. It is only the smallest minority of this population who is truly unsavable. And so I think that's important to keep in mind.
Great. So in part 3, you finish off the text with prognosis, where you tell us, how to better frame the discussion around urban violence. One of the things I really loved about that section about how you steer us away, help us to avoid the pitfalls of talking about Black on Black crime and how harmful that is to the overall discussion. You then also provide real life success stories, even some from prison to the boardroom, fairy tale like success stories that prove that these measures can be successful. And then you end by laying out practical guides, both on the national and the local level, on how to reduce homicides. And you say by 50% in 8 years. That's reduce homicides by 50% in less than a decade. I mean, based on what we've already talked about the overall cost of urban violence, that the savings there are measurable, not to mention, the lack of loss of life. So can we talk about how we frame the discussion and the prognosis?
Sure. So, I think it's important to know that in doing my research for this book, yes, I did all of this empirical work to study this issue carefully. But this is really my life's work. I've been working on this issue in one capacity or another my whole life. When I was in law school, I taught at an urban high school in DC where my favorite student was murdered. I prosecuted street crime as a prosecutor in New York City. And as a researcher and a political official, I've been all across the country working on this issue. So I've seen it from many capacities. It's also a personal issue to me. And so when I wrote this book, I drew on a lot of my personal relationships, and I engaged with a lot of people, not just high-level policymakers and academics, but also people who had really lived this stuff. Mothers like Kim Odom, whose son was tragically murdered, Stephen Odom. I talked to her and other family members who had lost loved ones. I talked to former shooters, former gang members, about how they had turned their lives around. Eddie Bocanegra, the director of Ready Chicago, one of the premier anti-violence efforts in the nation, had a long history of gang involvement and ultimately spent time in prison before changing his life and becoming a huge change agent in this area. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that we need to really believe, based on the science, but based on our own experience, that rehabilitation and that recovery is possible, not just for individuals, but for us as a society. And so, one of the things that I saw when I started putting dollars and cents to this is that these solutions, while they're effective, they don't cost that much because they're so focused. They're only focused on a small number of people and places. They don't cost much. They don't require larger legislation. I'm a firm believer that we need more gun control, more reasonable restrictions on gun control. But this can happen before that. And in addition, they don't require massive institutional reform. Police departments, public health departments, service providers can start working on this today. And if they do, when I crunched the numbers, I saw something remarkable, which is that we could expect at least a 10% reduction in homicide in a particular city that does this right every year for more than 8 years. And that could get a more than 50% reduction in homicide over 8 years. And then if you spread that over, let's say 40 cities, that will ultimately save more than 12,000 lives over 8 years, which is truly stunning. And I'm very pleased to say that the Biden campaign picked up on this plan and in fact committed to spending this $900 million over 8 years in order to address this. And $900 million might sound like a lot, might sound like more than $100 million a year. But remember, that's one fighter plane at the Department of Defense. And so this is actually quite achievable. And so I hope that people will approach this with a sense of urgency, given the horrible year that we had last year in the sense of urban violence, but also with a sense of optimism. This is not a problem that we don't know how to solve. And it's not a problem that we have to change everything about the way we do things to solve. If we spend a modest amount of money and we spend it the right way, we can have significant positive results.
And one of the things that I don't even know if we glossed over it, but these success stories, these individuals bring credibility to the movement. I mean, when I've been out in the streets for a long time, and individuals that are in the game, they see me, and sometimes the bars and stars get in the way. They don't know that I came up in one of the toughest areas of the city. They don't know that, my mother has 2 sons. One of us is in jail for life, and the other one of us is running a, police department. They don't see all of these things. But when you have these reformed individuals whose names ring out because of the fact that they were so heavily involved in the game and behaviors, I've seen some of the most ingrained individuals put their guns down and help join the movement because of the credibility that these individuals bring. So thank you for laying out your plan and laying out the book. I hope everyone gets a picture of why they need to buy this book and use it as a practical guide on how to deal with violence and urban violence.
Absolutely. I think it's a great point. And, one of the sort of pleasures of this work is working with individuals. Sometimes the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so one thing we really have to understand is that many of the leaders in this new movement to reduce violence are from these communities, have made mistakes, and have changed their lives to remedy those mistakes. And they have a form of knowledge that is absolutely essential. And I drew upon a lot of their knowledge in writing the book, but it's not the same as getting the story from them directly. And so we have to keep them at the center of this work as well. So, Commissioner, we're speaking at an incredibly difficult time. And as we discussed before this, I think it would be a shame if the audience didn't also hear from you and some of your views. And so I just want to ask you a few questions right now. It has been an extraordinarily challenging year in so many ways, but particularly for law enforcement. You faced COVID-19. You faced national protests about the police and calls for defunding the police. And we've witnessed riots recently concerning our election. And this is all in addition to this massive increase in urban violence. And so I want to sort of ask you about these in reverse order. Beginning with the urban violence, what is the police role in reducing violence? I mean, it's obviously partly a police responsibility, but it can't be exclusively a responsibility. So I wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, you touched on, so reducing violent crime is always going to be the collective responsibility of the community. And, policing really should be seen as part of the community. As you know, the answer is rarely going to lie at one end of the continuum where it's completely the police's responsibility, or at the other end of the continuum where police shouldn't have any involvement. The answer usually lies somewhere in between. So I think that, with that being said, I think that the vast majority of crime prevention or reduction does fall outside of police and really is accomplished through informal social controls and community norms. But if I could take it back to that social contract argument where individuals give up certain rights in exchange for certain protections, the government has to have the authority, the policing authority, to step in when individuals step outside of those accepted norms, or to step in to settle disputes when they're going to occur. So, but the responsibility to deal with violence is always going to be a shared one. The police, we're going to be charged with physically going out and making arrests, but the entire community has to be responsible for fixing responsibility or blame. And that means that the community should have a say-so in how to restore itself. I think that, in my opinion, we need more restorative processes, and they need to become more prevalent. Let me say that.
Right. And just to follow up, and Boston last year experienced a 50% increase in homicides. What happened last year in Cambridge, and what's been happening in Cambridge?
So you're gonna have me showing how superstitious I am and knocking on wood, but we've seen a steady reduction in violent crime. Once again, this is a different, landscape that we have. We're a city that averages around 12 shooting victims a year and 2 gun-related homicides a year. And in the past 3 years, we've had 5 shooting victims, 1 shooting victim, and 0 shooting victims, and 0 gun-related homicides. We've had a homicide in each of those years, but no 1 homicide in each of those years, but none gun-related. So we've been fortunate, but we're still susceptible to all of the ills of society. The borders are imaginary. So crime does happen here, and violent crime, urban violence happens here in the city of Cambridge, but we've been fortunate.
Let me turn to these other challenges. Anyone who loves democracy had to be appalled by what we witnessed last week. What happened in your view, and how do police and other members of law enforcement address issues like this moving forward?
So last week, well, how do we address that moving forward? Well, that's a giant and complex political issue also. But if you mean in terms of preparedness or the lack of preparedness for that incident, it was completely unacceptable. I know that several resignations follow, but a complete review needs to be conducted. As you know, that area is so resource rich that to be caught so flat-footed and unprepared is really completely unacceptable, particularly in light of how much information was available in the public domain. So what happened, I can't begin to tell you. I know that I've been hearing a lot of my friends say that it couldn't be anything but willful unpreparedness, but a complete investigation needs to go and happen in that. But what I do know is that I think that it's a mistake to compare what happened last week to what we saw happen over the summer. The actions and events over the summer, in my opinion, were the actions of those of oppressed individuals who were seeking redress from the government. The actions that we saw last week were really an act of tyranny by a group of radicalized individuals. Here you had the president who used his position to mislead and incite anger, not just last week or since the election, but over the course of a few years. And in my opinion, he should be held accountable politically in the form of impeachment, but then also criminally in the form of prosecution when he leaves office. And we also might want to rethink our position on whether a president can be charged with a crime while he or she is in office. Maybe just a few crimes like treason, bribery, or insurrection, all of which I think you got varying degrees that this president may have committed while he was in office. And when I say may have, I mean certainly did commit.
Thank you for that answer. I think it's really important for us to push back on the false equivalence of protesters, mostly peacefully, all over the country, pushing to improve their country by reducing police excessive force, and a highly aggressive, targeted effort to reverse the results of a lawful election. Those are not the same thing. The people who participated in those don't have the same views, perspectives, or motives. And so I completely agree with you there. But let me sort of build on that and talk about those who were engaged in protests over the summer and continuing. The deaths of George Floyd and many others have really triggered a crisis of confidence in law enforcement. How do we restore that confidence moving forward?
That's a wonderful question. So in my opinion, and I always got to wrap my mind around how I want to say this. So you're never going to adequately address the issue of distrust between police and the community until you address the issues that foster the most distrust. And I think right away, the two biggest issues are race and transparency. And then when you talk about transparency, accountability comes right along with that. So I think that you can accept as fact that minorities are disparately impacted at every key decision-making point throughout the criminal justice system. So we have to be able to show the community that we're capable of serious introspection, the kind that's going to uncover serious flaws if they exist, and they certainly do, and then work to improve and eliminate those, but do so transparently or publicly. So, you know, I believe that focusing on implementing comprehensive programs aimed at identifying and eliminating racial profiling, racially biased policing, identifying those individuals who are in need of training, or more serious individuals, do yeoman's work to helping us rebuild trust with the community. So here I'm focused on establishing a watchdog-like entity that uses well-designed metrics that proactively search for and identify not only individuals and supervisors, but processes that produce disparate impact. So I just don't think that any community is going to trust this police department if it doesn't feel like it can hold it accountable, particularly if that agency is seen as resisting efforts to hold it accountable. And I think that as a profession, we do that far too often. We make the mistake of being indignant when we should be introspective, and we do it, I mean, historically. We've done it, and it causes us to ignore some of the louder cries. And that's just my opinion.
You know, I completely agree with you. And, you know, one thing I have been thinking about as we confront this massive challenge is that there really isn't sort of one thing that we can say, or a soundbite, or one speech, or one meeting that can resolve all of these things. It's really ultimately about doing the work, and about the hard, difficult work of restoring confidence. One of the things that I've seen again and again in the work of urban violence is people don't trust each other at first, but they decide to work together because they believe in something. And so community members and police officers and others will engage, not trusting one another at first, but as they grow to know each other and as they experience success, they overcome it. And so one of the things that I say is, yes, we need reconciliation. Yes, we need to do these things. But the best way to get started is just by doing the work and getting to know each other and experience each other better. I also ultimately believe that public safety and enhanced legitimacy go hand in hand. I think one thing that's been very toxic that the Trump administration has done is it's sort of posed a false choice to Americans, saying you either believe in law and order or you believe in chaos and lawlessness. You either completely endorse the police no matter what they do,
Blindly loyal, yeah,
or you're part of the problem. And I think what we see is that smart, meaningful reform of the criminal justice system will go hand in hand with actually keeping people safe.
And we've promulgated those same false choices in the professional law enforcement. You know, we historically have told folks, I can either keep you safe or I can uphold your civil rights. If you want more of this, you're gonna get less of this, and vice versa. And that's not true. You can get, you can get both. And so we're guilty, and the Trump administration and other political administrations before that have seized on those false choices.
Absolutely. Well, I think now is probably a good time to hear from the rest of the folks listening. So love to get their questions, and welcome back, Myra.
Hey, thank you very much. That's very, very interesting. We've got a large handful of questions. I'm going to start with Liz asking, what is the role of gun control in reducing urban violence?
Thomas, you want to start off with that one? I'll follow up if there's time.
Sure. So I think it's important to understand that urban violence is in many ways a function of too many guns and not a function of too many guns. And I'll explain what I mean. At the end of the day, the difference between the United States and many of its other wealthy nations in terms of its homicide rate is that we have many, many more guns. We are actually not that much more criminal than many of our other wealthy peers. And we're not actually that much more violent in terms of just assaults. For instance, the UK has higher rate of assaults generally than the US, but we're more lethal. And that lethality is because we have so many more weapons. And so in the long run, meaningful gun control is essential to reducing this thing. However, we have so many illegal weapons already in the hands of criminals today that those efforts, those long-term efforts, need to be supplemented by short and medium-term efforts like the ones we're discussing today. And so my argument with gun control is that it's both and. You don't want to just do what I'm recommending on urban violence, and you don't want to just do what the good work that many advocates are recommending in terms of background checks, clip limits, all of these other smart ideas. And so really the movement, the gun violence movement to reduce gun violence needs to contemplate, aligning all of these interests, those who are trying to reduce mass shootings, those who are trying to reduce domestic homicides, suicides, and of course, the largest single contributor to homicides, which is urban violence.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have much to add on and concur with you completely. It's not gun ownership. Legal gun ownership is, a bedrock principle in this country. It's the illegal behaviors that Thomas concentrates on in the book that are the problem. And that's what we need to focus on, the illegal gun ownership. We want to keep guns out of the hands of individuals who would use them for illegal purposes and aren't allowed to have them. So there are enough laws on the book. We just need to focus on the illegal behaviors.
From Kristen, are there organizations here locally or nationally that address creating coalitions to address working with problematic individuals?
So Thomas, you spent your career working with these organizations and creating them. So would you talk about that for us?
Sure. I mean, I don't have a list at my fingers, but I'll say there's a lot of great organizations working on this in Boston and the general area. There's organizations like ROCA, like Inner City Weightlifting, like Boston Uncornered and UTEC, just to name a few, that are really working with the highest risk individuals and trying to give them alternatives to engaging in violence. We're actually, relative to the rest of the country, relatively lucky in terms of having a lot of smart people working on these things. And the frustration in the Boston area is not that we don't have great people, talented people doing good work. It's that we can't seem to finally get that coordination function to sort of really sustainably solve the problem.
So one of the things you touch on in the book, one of the many things you touch on is what I call a vocal majority, meaning you said that you have to create a new political constituency that advocate for these practical solutions, and that constituency didn't have to be large, they just had to be loud. So, a small group of individuals that were a minority of individuals that were so loud that they, were too loud to ignore. So it sounded like the majority. And I thought that was key because that type of approach is very effective when it comes to advocacy.
Absolutely. I just want to point out that, there's right now there's 260 people participating in this call. If those 260 people pooled their energy, just those people pooled their little bit of their time and a little bit of their energy and a little bit of their money and said, we demand evidence-based and community-based solutions to urban violence. We demand these solutions, Mayor Walsh or whoever the next mayor will be, or to the city, to the Cambridge leadership, they would happen. That's enough. That's enough political capital. And so that's really an important point, is that, we individually can do something on this issue.
And referring to the note at the beginning of your talk, saying that 2020 was one of the worst years ever and seeing an increase. Why has this past year been so terrible? Is it attributable to the pandemic?
It's a great question, and I've done some research on this with a colleague of mine, Richard Rosenfeld, and I would describe what's happened in 2020 as something of a perfect storm, a connection of a lot of things happening at the same time to drive homicide rates up. I think the first thing is obviously the coronavirus pandemic. The pandemic placed both individuals and institutions under enormous pressure. So unfortunately, poor people of color who are at the highest risk for community violence, for police violence, and now are also at the highest risk for COVID-19, were placed under enormous pressure. And many of the highest risk individuals within those communities lost a lot of supports and services. And at the same time, the institutions that are responsible for responding to urban violence, police, hospitals, EMS, violence interrupters, community-based providers, they were all placed under enormous pressure, financial pressure, operation pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that all weakened the sort of anti-violence,
safety net.
Right. But interestingly, we did not see a massive spike in homicides at the beginning of the pandemic. They held mostly flat across the country. But then what we saw is this spark with the death of George Floyd and the unrest that followed. And we saw a massive spike in homicide over the summer across most cities in the United States. And so there, what we're seeing is that police violence can trigger community violence. And it does that in at least two ways. Number one, the response to the police violence, which is completely understandable, can make it almost impossible to do the type of policing that reduces homicide, that type of proactive interaction with the highest risk individuals. And so when police, commit horrible, brutal crimes in broad daylight, and the public understandably reacts, all of the other important things that police do are now made much harder. And in addition, quite understandably, when people living in neighborhoods where they feel over-policed already see something like this, they say, well, that's it. I'm not going to trust the police entirely. I'm not going to give them any information about any crimes that I see. And if something happens to me or someone I care about, I'll handle it myself. And unfortunately, that creates cycles of violent retribution that spin out of control. And I think that's what we saw. And so I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that police violence can lead to community violence.
And we can go to the next question. Professor
Anonymous attendee says, my son's street in Baltimore had urban violence performed by two gangs that congregated around a liquor store. The neighbors got together and asked the police for help. The police came and met on the street with the leaders, who were clearly known to them. The gangs then moved to another street, but this didn't solve the problem of violence. It just moved to another street. What should have been done?
One of the things that Thomas talks about in the book is the need to sustain the actions that you take. While displacement is an effective strategy, if you're only concerned with one small area, it becomes less effective a strategy as you move up in the organization or as your area of responsibility grows, because you can't just push the problem around in your own area. So what should have been done is they should have worked with the community to have sustainable measures put in place to deal with, as Thomas talks about, our people, that place, And I don't know if it was that liquor store per se or other things around about that corner, but sustainability has got to be one of the goals that you entered those type of problems looking at. I know I can't keep 100 cops on a corner forever, so I have to be able to, in many ways, turn that neighborhood back over to the community, but make sure that I sustain efforts there. And doesn't sound like that happened in that neighborhood.
So it also has to be not just a place-based effort, but a people-based effort. And the other thing I would say is that while that's very unfortunate in that circumstance, the evidence shows that often there's something special about that location. And so even if people are pushed to a different location, violence often, even if it's displaced, is reduced. And so I would just point out that the displacement phenomenon is actually quite small normally, although that it may not have happened in that particular incident.
And I think this is an important one. Kristen asked, what does evidence-based mean?
That's a great question, really great question. And I actually prefer the term evidence-informed. And basically what it means is getting the best data and science and facts and information possible before making an important decision in this area. It doesn't mean that for every single decision that a government or a nonprofit needs to make, that there's some great study that tells them exactly what to do and exactly how to do it. But what it means is really taking the time to educate yourself both about the problems and about the potential solutions, and understanding that ultimately this is not a perfect process, but this is the best process to make important decisions. I often, when I was teaching at Harvard, talked about evidence-informed policymaking the way Winston Churchill talked about democracy. You know, Winston Churchill once said, and I'm paraphrasing, that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all of the other forms of government. And I think that's the right way to approach evidence-informed policymaking. It's the worst way to make policy decisions, except for all the other ways. And so it's better than relying on your gut. It's better than relying on your prejudices. It's better than relying on your emotions. And it's better than relying on politics.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. We're at the end of our hour. That was very enlightening. There are many other questions, but we'll have to take a stop there. I'd like to thank our audience for coming again this week and hope to see you all next week. Ambassador Wendy Sherman will be joining us. She's a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and her title, title of her talk is Not for the Faint of Heart: Lessons on Courage, Power, and Persistence. Thank you all for joining us. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Get the book. It's a great guide.
Thanks. Bye-bye.